Hey y'all, so I am back home with all of my books so I can finally film my top 15 of 2015 list. These are my 15 favorite books that I read in 2015. Now these don't necessarily have to have come out in 2015, I just have to have read them in 2015. And typically I would put on the stipulation that it doesn't include rereads, but I don't think I reread any books this year, so regardless, no rereads, any books that I read for the first time in 2015 are eligible for this list. Something that is slightly abnormal about my list that I don't think most booktubers do is that I completely separate out every single book of a series or trilogy. I put them in their own individual slot because I tend to like certain books of series more than others, so I don't want to put a series in slot number 10 if the first book was absolutely amazing and the last book was just kind of meh. So I will split every single series up, so you may see like 3 books from a series in their own slots or just 1 book from a series. It just all depends on how much I like that individual book in the series. That being said, books 14 and 15 on this list are actually from the same series, so I figured I'd go ahead and talk about them together, and those are volumes 1 and 3 from the Saga comic series, which is by Brian K. Vaughan, illustrated by Fiona Staples. Now, I have rated all 3 of the volumes that I've read so far from this series an 8.5 out of 10, including the second one, which just barely missed out being on the list. But I did rank this one at number 14 and this one at number 15 just because I did slightly like volume 3 a little bit better. This is a really cool sci-fi comic series and I've really grown to love it. It's one of those series where each individual volume rates at about like an 8.5, where it's good but not like outstanding. But if I were to rate the series overall, I would give it a 5-star rating because the overarching plot and the world is just so cool. For me, there's definitely a reason that this is probably the most popular comic series on BookTube, just because the world is so huge and the characters are really awesome and the overarching plot is super cool. That being said, I rated both of these 8.5 out of 10, and these are slots 14 and 15. Coming in at number 13 on my list is The Runaway King by Jennifer A. Nielsen, which is book 2 in the Ascendance trilogy. The Ascendance trilogy was one of the first things that I read in 2015, and while I loved the whole thing, the second book is definitely my favorite, and it is the one that made the list. The series follows an orphan boy named Sage, who is recruited by a man named Connor to impersonate this prince who went missing several years before. This middle grade trilogy is just really fast-paced and exciting, and Sage is just such a super cool main character. He's one of my favorite main characters of all time. He's really sassy and snarky, and I just really enjoy him as a narrator. This book in the trilogy is especially fast-paced, and that's why I really love it. There are some really crazy cool things that happen in this one, and that is why this made my number 13 slot. I think that when I went through and re-rated my books earlier this year, I ended up giving this one a 9 out of 10, and I also have a full discussion on the trilogy, which I will link down in the description. The book coming in at number 12 was one of my most anticipated releases of 2015, and that was A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab, which I gave 9 out of 10 stars. Now, like I did say in my initial discussion about this book, it took a while to get really hooked into it, but once I did, I was just so invested in the world and the plot and the characters, and I just really enjoyed pretty much every aspect of this book. I really love both of the main characters in this series. They're both really interesting and really cool, and I also love the parallel Londons aspect to it because it's really interesting to see these very different versions of the same city, and I also loved the plot of this one, and it has me really intrigued to see where the rest of the series goes. Coming in at number 11 was The Arithmetist by Brandon Sanderson, which I also gave 9 out of 10 stars. This was a very pleasant surprise. I expected to like this because I had already read other books by Brandon Sanderson that I really enjoyed, but I didn't expect in the less than 400-page book to get incredibly invested in the characters and the world and the plot like I did, because usually it takes me a little bit longer to get that hooked in. The premise of this book is that the main character, Joel, goes to a school where there are both normal students and arithmetists. Arithmetists are able to use a chalk-based form of magic, and Joel is incredibly obsessed with the form of magic, but he will never be able to become a arithmetist because he wasn't chosen at a ceremony that happened, I think, when he was 8. And like I said, I was interested in this one, but it totally took me by surprise with how much I absolutely loved it. Joel is a really cool main character, the system of magic is super cool and pretty well explained, and Brandon Sanderson's writing is amazing. And the way that this one left off was super cool, and it left me really intrigued to see what's going to happen next. Coming in at number 10 is Cress by Marissa Meyer, which is the third book in the Lunar Chronicles series, and I gave this one 9 out of 10 stars. This is another one that it took me a while to get into it. I think the first 150 pages, I was not super convinced that I was going to love this one. I thought it would just be a decent installment in the series, but the last 150 pages completely redeemed the first 150 pages, and the middle stuff was pretty cool too, but those last 150 pages were insane, and I think I read them in an hour, which is super fast for me. And the way that this one left off just had me so super intrigued for winter and wanting it, even though I finished this in June and winter didn't come out until November. But this was just a really wonderful installment in the Lunar Chronicles series, and I would obviously recommend the series to everyone. It's so cool. I mean, most people have already read it, but I loved this. Coming in at number 9 is Witches Volume 1 by Scott Snyder, which I gave 9.5 stars out of 10. What I will say about this is that as a single volume, this is definitely my favorite comic that I have ever read. However, if I were to rank the Saga series just as itself among this list, I would still put it higher because I'm more invested in it at this point, but this was an outstanding trade comic. I've mentioned this a few times, but I have to reiterate how much I love the art in this comic. There are these cool watercolor stains across everything, and it's got such really pretty vivid colors, and the story was just not exactly what I was expecting, but in a really great way. This comic definitely took some really interesting turns, and it was definitely really creepy, and I just really enjoyed it. And that is why it is at number 9 on my list. Coming in at number 8 is The Body Electric by Beth Revis, which I also gave 9.5 stars. Beth Revis, as I've said many times, is one of my absolute favorite authors, and this was not a disappointment in the slightest. I do have a full review on this book, which I will link down in the description, and that's where I kind of go into detail about the whole plot of this because it's really confusing and crazy. Basically, this is a sci-fi dystopian in a world where there's a technology where you can relive your memories, or in the main character Ella's case, go into other people's memories. But then some crazy things start happening, and Ella realizes that her memory has been tampered with. And that is kind of the jumping point of this really fast-paced, exciting, and crazy novel. This is just a really awesome book with lots of crazy twists and turns, and I absolutely flew through it and loved it so much. This is just an absolutely crazy, fast-paced, wonderful book with a really interesting world and cool characters, and Beth Revis has yet to disappoint me. I loved this. Coming in at number 7 is Night Film by Marisha Pessl. I've talked about this one quite a bit, and I do have a full written review, which I will leave down in the description, but this was just a really atmospheric, really creepy book that actually freaked me out. I don't get creeped out by books, but this one freaked me out. We follow a reporter named Scott who kind of was disgraced after delving too far into the life of this cult horror film director. But when that director's daughter seemingly commits suicide, Scott delves back into the life of this reclusive horror movie director, and it is a really creepy and exciting ride. Like I said, this book just has a really creepy atmosphere to it. I was so engrossed in the story, and the fact that it has interactive elements like an app and web page pictures in here, it's just super engrossing, and I absolutely loved it, and I gave it 9.5 stars out of 10. Coming in at number 6 is Winter by Marissa Meyer, which is the 4th and final book in the Lunar Chronicles, and I gave this one 9.5 stars out of 10. I don't know what to say about this. It was just a really awesome, fast-paced conclusion to the series. I was really happy with the way that everything concluded, and I thought that it was just really interesting seeing all of the storylines woven together so beautifully, and I really loved it. I have fallen in love with the series. It's just super cool. Coming in at number 5 is The Hero of Ages by Brandon Sanderson, which is book 3 in the Mistborn trilogy. And I ended up giving this one 9.5 stars out of 10 once I adjusted my ratings in August. I love this trilogy. It is amazing, and this was just a really fast-paced and action-packed conclusion to it. I read the majority of this book in a single day, in almost a single sitting, because I just couldn't wait to see what happened to this world and these characters that I had fallen in love with. This is just a really awesome conclusion to what has become my favorite trilogy of all time. Coming in at number 4 is I'll Give You the Sun by Jandy Nelson, which I ended up giving 9.5 stars out of 10 once I adjusted my ratings at the end of August. If you told me a year ago that there would be a contemporary novel in the 4th slot on my top books of 2015 list, I would have rolled my eyes at you and thought you were crazy, because contemporary novels are sometimes my thing, but even when they are my thing, they never get this high. Like, they never beat out amazing fantasy novels. But I just really loved this one. I love when there are multiple storylines that weave together in really complex ways, and this did that beautifully. I'll Give You the Sun tells the story of twins Jude and Noah and has 2 separate storylines. Jude is a girl and she tells the story starting from when they're 16, and Noah is a boy and he tells the story starting from when they're 13. And their 2 stories weave in together in a really interesting and complex way, and it's just so beautifully written, and I absolutely loved this book. Some people had some complaints about the ending, but I did not. I loved how it ended, and I loved this book a lot. And now we've gotten down to my top 3 books, which are the 3 books that I gave full 10 out of 10 stars to this year, which is a big deal for me because 10 out of 10 star ratings are not incredibly common, given that I gave out 3 of them this year. And if you've been following my channel for any length of time, you probably already know what they are, but let's get on to them anyway. At number 3, we have The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. This book took me ages to finish because it's so big, but it was incredibly worth it, and I just absolutely fell in love with this series, and I know I haven't continued it yet, but it's amazing. In this trilogy, the main character, Kvothe, is a very famous individual, and he is telling his story to a chronicler. Book 1 is the first day of his story, and it is basically his childhood up through his teenage years. I have to admit, I was really intimidated going into this one because I was worried it would be really dense and it would be hard to get through, but the writing is both beautiful and easy to read at the same time, which is why I really love this. And on top of that, this world and the magic system in this world are just so insanely interesting, and I fell in love with this. And I'm gonna wait until the 3rd book comes out, I think, to complete the trilogy, because I want to make sure I reread this and then continue on to the 2nd one before I have to reread everything. Coming in at number 2 on the list is The Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson, which is the 2nd book in the Mistborn trilogy. I mean, I'm sure you're all shocked, like you thought I hated this book, right? I love the twists and turns that Brandon Sanderson puts into his books. I love his writing. It's just, Brandon Sanderson can do no wrong in my book. And finally, I'm sure the number 1 on this list is going to come as a huge, shocking surprise, but it is The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson, which is the 1st book in the Mistborn trilogy. As I've said, this is probably my favorite book that I have read since Harry Potter. I think that the world is amazing. The characters are amazing. I love everything about this book specifically and the entire trilogy. This one, like I said, is my absolute favorite in the trilogy for reasons that I don't want to get into because of spoilers, but I love the way that the magic is explained in this book, and I love, like I said, everything about this book. This book is amazing, and I can't come up with words to explain how much I love this book. It's just, I finished it and I wanted to reread it, and I wanted to hold it and hug it and never let it go. Like, I love it. And I did just want to go ahead and throw in my biggest disappointment of 2015, just because I felt it was so far below everything else that I read this year, and that was The Leveler by Julia Durango, which is the 1st book in her new Leveler series. I've talked extensively about my opinions on this, so I won't go into too much detail. I will link both the video on my changing my ratings, which I talked about this one in, and my June wrap-up down in the description, because I talked about this book pretty extensively in each of those. I just thought that this was overall not good. Like, the writing, the characters, the romance, the plot, just everything. And now, since this is kind of my 2015 reading wrap-up type thing, I did want to do a little bit of housekeeping as far as the number of books I read and the number of series that I read and my like unread read books / ratio on my shelves. So in 2015, I completed 43 books, which is okay. It's definitely less than I read in 2014, and I didn't get to read as much as I really wanted to, but I do think that I read a lot of really great books, so 43 is a decent number. Within those 43 books, I did read 4 complete series this year, which were The Ascendance Trilogy by Jennifer A. Nielsen, the Lock and Key comic series by Joe Hill, illustrated by Gabriel Rodriguez, the Mistborn Trilogy by Brandon Sanderson, and the Lunar Chronicle series by Marissa Meyer. As of the end of 2015, my library sits at 175 books, 94 of which I have read and 81 of which I have not read. So that is about 46% of my library, but that is also including some rather large book outlet orders that I placed at the end of the year but didn't get to me until 2016, but I went ahead and included them anyway because I did technically buy them in 2015. And that book outlet haul will be coming soon, separate from my end of the year book haul and my January book haul. And I do hope to do some sort of bookshelf tour sometime soon before the end of the semester, but I don't know if that'll happen or not. We'll just have to wait and see. So that is it for my top 15 books of 2015, as well as my kind of reading wrap up for 2015. Let me know down in the comments what you thought about the books that I talked about in this video today. As always, I will leave links down in the description to my blog, Twitter, and Goodreads. Please add me as a friend on Goodreads. I would love to be friends with all of you. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!